March 19th, 1943. North Riverside, Illinois, just outside Chicago. The morning was cold, steel-gray sky, wind cutting through the empty rail yard. At 10:38 a.m., a man stepped from a black sedan and walked slowly toward the train tracks. He wore a dark overcoat, his hat pulled low, his hands trembling. The man was Frank Nitti, the official head of the Chicago outfit, the criminal empire once ruled by Al Capone. To the public, he was one of the most powerful gangsters in America. But that morning, something was wrong. Witnesses later said he looked pale, distracted, almost frightened. Nitti stood beside the tracks for several seconds. A train horn echoed somewhere in the distance. Then he reached into his coat. Not for a cigarette, not for money. A revolver. 2 shots rang out. Frank Nitti collapsed beside the railroad line, blood spreading across the gravel. At first, police called it suicide. A mob boss overwhelmed by legal pressure, cornered by federal investigators. But inside the underworld of Chicago, another explanation circulated quietly. One far more disturbing. Frank Nitti had not simply taken his life. He had been ordered to die. And the reason traced back to a massive Hollywood extortion scheme, a federal investigation, and a secret vote inside the Chicago outfit that sealed his fate. This was not just the death of a mob boss. It was the moment the outfit proved that even its own leader was disposable. Long before the railroad tracks outside Chicago, before the federal investigations, before the quiet panic that gripped the leadership of the Chicago outfit, Frank Nitti was simply another immigrant trying to survive in America's underworld. He was born Francesco Raffaele Nitto in 1886 in the small Italian town of Angri, near Naples. Poverty was ordinary there. Opportunity was not. Like thousands of others at the turn of the century, he left Europe searching for something better across the Atlantic. But Chicago in the early 1900s was not a city of simple opportunity. It was a city of factions, political machines, street gangs, bootleggers, labor rackets. And young immigrants quickly learned that survival often required alliances. Nitti arrived in Chicago as a young man and found work where many others did, on the edges of legality. At first, he was not known for violence. In fact, compared to many gangsters of the era, he was considered unusually controlled. Quiet, reserved, observant, he built relationships carefully. By the early 1920s, his path crossed with one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, Al Capone. Capone had inherited the criminal empire of Johnny Torrio, and the rise of Prohibition in the United States had transformed organized crime into a national industry. Bootlegging alone generated millions of dollars every year. Capone needed more than gunmen. He needed men who understood money. Frank Nitti became one of those men. Inside the Capone organization, Nitti managed the financial machinery behind the violence. While others ran breweries or controlled speakeasies, Nitti oversaw collections, laundering, and the quiet movement of profits. It earned him a nickname, whispered throughout Chicago's underworld, the Enforcer, not because he personally carried out killings, but because when debts were unpaid or orders ignored, it was Nitti who made sure consequences followed. His loyalty to Capone was absolute. His discipline was rare. And when federal authorities finally broke Capone's empire with the Al Capone tax evasion conviction in 1931, a dangerous vacuum opened at the top of Chicago's criminal hierarchy. Someone had to replace the most famous gangster in America. Publicly, the answer was simple: Frank Nitti. But inside the outfit, the truth was already far more complicated. When Al Capone entered federal prison in 1931, after the Al Capone tax evasion conviction, the newspapers declared the end of an era in Chicago. For nearly a decade, Capone had dominated the city's criminal economy. Bootlegging, gambling, protection rackets, labor control. But organized crime does not disappear when a leader falls. It reorganizes. Inside the Chicago outfit, Capone's absence created an immediate problem: visibility. The federal government had learned that destroying a single public figure could destabilize an entire empire. So the outfit made a strategic decision. The next leader would not be a celebrity gangster. He would be a manager. That man was Frank Nitti. In 1932, Nitti officially became the new boss of the Chicago outfit. On paper, the promotion seemed logical. He had Capone's trust, he understood the organization's finances, and he avoided unnecessary attention. But the structure of power inside the outfit had already changed. Unlike Capone's rule, which centered on one dominant personality, the outfit began shifting toward a committee-style leadership. Two figures quietly gained enormous influence behind the scenes: Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca. Both were disciplined operators. Neither sought headlines. And both believed the future of organized crime depended on reducing violence and expanding into more sophisticated rackets. Under this new structure, Nitti served as the official boss, but real strategic decisions were increasingly shared among a small inner circle. It was a calculated evolution. The outfit began moving away from the chaos of Prohibition-era gang wars and toward something more stable, almost corporate in structure. Their influence expanded through labor unions, gambling operations across the Midwest, loan sharking, political corruption, national racketeering partnerships. Chicago's underworld became quieter, but it also became far more powerful. By the late 1930s, the outfit had grown beyond a city organization. Its networks reached into Hollywood, major labor unions, and interstate gambling circuits. And this expansion required something new. Not street violence. Control. Control over industries, control over unions, control over entire economic sectors. For a time, the system worked perfectly. The outfit avoided the reckless publicity that had destroyed Capone. Profits increased. Federal attention faded. But hidden within this new corporate-style mafia structure was a dangerous weakness. When power is shared, responsibility becomes blurred. And when something goes wrong, someone must still take the blame. By the early 1940s, a new scheme began emerging inside the Chicago outfit, one that promised enormous profits. It targeted one of the most glamorous industries in America, Hollywood. And before long, that scheme would trigger a federal investigation powerful enough to bring the entire outfit leadership under threat. At the center of it all was Frank Nitti. By the early 1940s, the leadership of the Chicago outfit had learned an important lesson. Violence created headlines, headlines attracted prosecutors, and prosecutors destroyed empires. So the outfit shifted its strategy. Instead of fighting for territory in the streets of Chicago, they began targeting something far more profitable: industries. One industry in particular stood out: Hollywood. At the time, the American film industry controlled enormous financial power. Major studios such as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Bros., and 20th Century Fox were producing films that reached audiences around the world. But like many industries in America during that era, Hollywood depended heavily on labor unions, projectionists, stagehands, transportation workers. If those workers stopped cooperating, entire film productions could collapse overnight. The Chicago outfit understood this vulnerability. Through their connections with union leaders, particularly figures linked to the powerful International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, outfit leaders developed a simple strategy. They would not destroy the studios. They would pressure them. If studios refused to cooperate, strikes could suddenly appear. Equipment deliveries could be blocked. Theaters could stop showing films. Production delays in Hollywood cost enormous sums of money. And so the studios quietly paid. Millions of dollars flowed through the scheme. It was one of the most ambitious rackets the outfit had ever attempted. But there was a problem. Unlike bootlegging or gambling, Hollywood involved national attention. When labor disputes escalated, federal authorities began looking closer at the connections between union leadership and organized crime. Investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation started following money trails. Witnesses were questioned. Financial records were examined. Soon, prosecutors realized that the labor unrest surrounding Hollywood studios was not random. It was organized. And the investigation began moving toward the highest levels of the Chicago outfit. Inside the leadership circle, panic slowly began to grow, because someone had officially authorized the operation, someone whose name appeared in documents, someone whose position made him the most visible target for federal prosecutors. The official boss of the Chicago outfit, Frank Nitti. And in Washington, the government was preparing something far more dangerous than a routine investigation. They were preparing a federal racketeering trial that could send multiple outfit leaders to prison for decades. For the first time since Capone's conviction, the Chicago outfit faced a threat that could dismantle its entire leadership structure. And inside the organization, a quiet question began circulating. If someone had to fall, who would it be? By 1942, the investigation into Hollywood labor racketeering had moved far beyond rumors. Federal prosecutors were preparing indictments. The target was no longer just union leaders or middlemen. The investigation now pointed directly toward the leadership of the Chicago outfit. And the political environment in the United States had changed dramatically. America was now fully engaged in World War II. The federal government had little tolerance for organized crime operations that threatened major industries tied to national morale and wartime production. Hollywood films were not merely entertainment. They were instruments of wartime propaganda and national messaging. Any disruption to that system drew attention in Washington. Inside the U.S. Department of Justice, prosecutors began assembling one of the largest organized crime cases since the conviction of Al Capone. Indictments soon followed. Several key figures connected to the Chicago outfit were charged with extortion and conspiracy tied to the manipulation of Hollywood unions. Among those charged was Paul Ricca, one of the most powerful figures inside the outfit's inner circle. But the most important name in the indictment was the official boss, Frank Nitti. For prosecutors, charging Nitti served a strategic purpose. Taking down the boss would send a message to organized crime across the country. Federal authorities were once again prepared to strike at the top. Inside Chicago's underworld, however, the indictment created a very different reaction. Fear. Nitti had already experienced federal prison once before, following earlier tax charges in the 1930s. The experience had left him deeply shaken. Those close to him later said prison had changed him permanently. He developed severe claustrophobia. The thought of returning to a prison cell terrified him. And this new case was far more serious. If convicted, Nitti faced the possibility of a long federal sentence. But his personal fear was not the only problem. Within the outfit leadership, anger was growing. Some leaders believed the Hollywood scheme had been reckless. Others feared the federal investigation might expose broader operations across the country. If the government pushed hard enough, the trial could unravel years of carefully protected rackets. Someone needed to contain the damage. Someone needed to accept responsibility. And increasingly, powerful voices inside the outfit began saying the same thing. The boss should take the fall. For the first time since taking control of the organization, Frank Nitti was no longer protected by his position. Instead, his position had made him the perfect sacrifice. Inside the upper ranks of the Chicago outfit, power had always operated quietly. There were no official ballots, no written decisions. But when the leadership needed to act, meetings were arranged in private rooms across Chicago. restaurants after closing hours, hotel suites, back offices of businesses that existed only on paper. In early March 1943, several of those meetings began taking place. At the center of the discussion was the federal case tied to the Hollywood extortion scheme. The indictments had placed multiple outfit leaders in danger. Among them were men who held real operational power, including Paul Ricca. If Ricca were convicted and imprisoned, the outfit's national network could fracture. That possibility was unacceptable. And so the conversation shifted toward responsibility. Who had authorized the scheme? Officially, the answer pointed upward, toward the man whose name appeared at the top of the organization. Frank Nitti. For years, Nitti had functioned as the public face of the outfit's leadership structure. It had protected other figures from direct scrutiny. But now that visibility had become dangerous, some leaders proposed a solution common within organized crime. The boss would claim full responsibility. He would plead guilty, accept the sentence, protect the rest of the organization. In theory, the sacrifice would stabilize the outfit. But when the proposal was quietly presented to Nitti, something unexpected happened. He refused. For a man known for discipline and loyalty, the refusal shocked the leadership circle. Nitti knew what prison had done to Al Capone. He knew what federal confinement had done to his own mind. And this time, the sentence could be far longer. Inside the outfit, refusal from a boss created a dangerous problem. Because if the leader would not absorb the consequences, the organization itself could be exposed. Over the following days, Nitti became increasingly isolated. Calls stopped returning. Meetings grew shorter. Old allies became distant. The message was never written. But within the logic of organized crime, it was perfectly clear. Frank Nitti had been given a choice: face federal prison, or remove himself from the equation entirely. The final decision did not happen in a courtroom. It happened quietly, inside a meeting of senior figures within the Chicago outfit during the days leading up to March 19, 1943. The federal trial connected to the Hollywood extortion scheme was approaching. Prosecutors were prepared. Evidence had been assembled. And several of the outfit's most powerful figures, including Paul Ricca, were now facing the possibility of long prison sentences. The organization had reached a conclusion. The case had to be contained. But Frank Nitti had already made his position clear. He would not go to prison again. For men inside the mafia hierarchy, that refusal carried consequences. Leadership inside organized crime was not absolute authority. It was conditional, dependent on protecting the organization itself. If the boss became a liability, the structure adjusted. What happened next was never recorded officially. No written orders, no witnesses willing to testify. But investigators and historians later pieced together the likely sequence. A message was delivered to Frank Nitti. The choice was simple: a public trial that could damage the entire outfit, or a quiet end that would close the investigation against him. On the morning of March 19, 1943, Nitti left his home and drove west from Chicago to a remote area near North Riverside. Shortly before 11 a.m., he stepped out near a set of railroad tracks. Witnesses later recalled that he appeared deeply agitated. He paced briefly near the gravel beside the rails. Then he removed a revolver from his coat. 2 shots echoed across the rail yard. When police arrived, they found the body of the man who had once led one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. The official ruling was suicide. But inside the Chicago underworld, everyone understood what had really happened. The boss had not been murdered. He had been required to disappear. News of the death spread quickly through Chicago. Police described it as a suicide. A gangster overwhelmed by legal pressure. The newspapers repeated the explanation. To the public, the story appeared simple. Frank Nitti, facing federal prosecution tied to the Hollywood labor extortion case, had taken his own life. But the death did not end the investigation. Federal prosecutors continued pursuing the remaining defendants connected to the extortion scheme. Among them was one of the outfit's most powerful figures, Paul Ricca. In 1943, Ricca and several associates were convicted in federal court for their roles in the Hollywood racket. The trial exposed the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated labor unions connected to the American film industry. Yet, even in defeat, the outfit demonstrated its resilience. While Ricca faced imprisonment, leadership inside the organization quietly shifted again. Operational control increasingly moved toward another disciplined and cautious figure within the hierarchy, Tony Accardo. Accardo represented the new model of organized crime leadership. Low visibility, minimal publicity, maximum control. The lessons of the Nitti crisis were taken seriously. The Chicago outfit began operating with even greater secrecy, reducing public displays of power and avoiding the type of attention that had destroyed earlier leaders like Al Capone. Frank Nitti's death closed one chapter of Chicago's criminal history. But the organization he helped build did not collapse. It adapted. And in doing so, it revealed something unsettling about the true nature of mafia power. In the outfit, leaders were never permanent. They were simply temporary shields. The railroad tracks outside Chicago eventually returned to silence. Trains passed. Gravel shifted. The wind erased the final traces of that morning in March 1943. But the death of Frank Nitti revealed something deeper about the nature of organized crime. In public mythology, mafia bosses appear powerful, untouchable, surrounded by loyalty and fear. Reality is different. Inside organizations like the Chicago outfit, power does not belong to one man. It belongs to the system, a system built on profit, survival, and ruthless calculation. When Al Capone ruled Chicago during the era of Prohibition in the United States, violence dominated the headlines. Machine guns, gang wars, public spectacle. But the men who came after him understood something more enduring. The most powerful criminal organizations do not survive through chaos. They survive through discipline. Frank Nitti had once been the loyal enforcer who protected Capone's empire. Later, he became the official leader of that empire. Yet in the end, his authority meant very little. Because in organized crime, leadership does not guarantee protection. It simply determines who must absorb the consequences when the system is threatened. And on March 19, 1943, beside a quiet set of railroad tracks outside Chicago, the Chicago outfit proved a brutal truth. Even the boss is replaceable.